The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I've got Dr. Ethan Russo, who's one of the world's leading experts on medicinal cannabis. He's deeply involved in the medical cannabis sector and botanical therapeutics in general, both as a physician and a researcher. He's got a number of roles within cannabis and has worked in this area for quite a while, including working with GW Pharma, and he's recently started a new company called Credo Science, which we'll find out a bit more about in a minute. Ethan, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
No, real pleasure. How are you getting on during this strange time that we're living through?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I worked from home for 17 years, so this is really not new to me. The major difference in my life is I'm not getting on a plane every 7 to 10 days. So I've been very fortunate.
Yeah, well, it's good that you're used to it and you settled in. And maybe it's nice to hang out at home for a while, particularly if you're traveling a lot. Okay, cool. So I think we're going to talk today about terpenes, which is a topic that comes up a lot in cannabis. But obviously, you've done huge amounts of stuff in medical cannabis in general. So maybe it's a good starting place to find out a bit more about your background and how you got into medical cannabis specifically.
Sure. Well, I was pretty classically trained as a neurologist. Somewhere around 1990, I'd been in practice for 7 years and realized I was giving increasingly toxic drugs to my patients with less and less benefit. So I turned back to a teenage interest in medicinal plants. At the time, I was really interested in research in migraine. So I tried to find out the place in the world where there was the most indigenous knowledge about treating headaches. And it turned out, like so many things, to be the Amazon. So I took some Spanish classes at night, started researching and writing about medicinal plants for migraine. And subsequently, I made 2 trips to Peru in 94 and then for about 3 months in 1995 to work with the Machigenga tribe in the Amazonian jungle. They had many plants used to treat migraine and also a lot of psychoactive plants. When I came back, I knew that I wanted to transition my career into research in medicinal plants. By that time, it was 1996, and I quickly became embroiled in the cannabis controversy, tried to do research on cannabis and migraine, but got thwarted by the federal laws in the states. But nonetheless, delved deeper and deeper, started writing and editing material in relation to cannabis. I started a journal called the Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics. Then in 1998, the year that GW Pharmaceuticals got a permit to grow cannabis for medicinal purposes from the British Home Office, I was asked to come on as a consultant with them. And then 5 years later, in 2003, I came on full-time as senior medical advisor. So I was heavily involved in the development programs for Sativex and Epidiolex, as well as being a liaison to basic scientists around the world that were working with GW materials. Along the way, actually back in 1996, I became acquainted with the medicinal properties of essential oils, terpenes and terpenoids, and got really fascinated with that. And obviously it dovetails with cannabis very nicely because to me, they're critical components of the medicinal effects of cannabis. People may have the misconception that cannabis is all about the pharmacology of THC and perhaps CBD, but they're neglecting some 500 other compounds in cannabis that contribute in large measure to its therapeutic properties.
Wow. I mean, that is some background. Would be remiss of me not to ask about a bit about GW. I mean, that's quite early on. And at the time, were you thinking, this is going to be a real struggle to convince the FDA to approve something? Or was everyone sort of really confident?
No. It was always well known to the people involved that it was going to be a tremendous challenge and remains so to this day. As it stands, Sativex is approved in 30 countries, but not in the USA. In the rest of the world, Sativex was approved for treatment of spasticity, muscle tightness, and multiple sclerosis. The company that had the rights at that time in the US was Otsuka in Japan, and they were more interested in cancer pain. After 2 successful phase 2 clinical trials, the phase 3 trials did not read out. And there was a reason for that. It worked quite well in the American subspecies, but a lot of the patients were much, much sicker. The patient cohorts from Romania and Poland. And being that it was so late in their disease, there just wasn't a material benefit that was demonstrable in treating their cancer pain. So those studies didn't read out. But subsequently, Epidiolex was actually first approved in the US through the FDA. So that's a 98% pure cannabidiol compound used to treat Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. So that was the first cannabis-derived pharmaceutical that was approved by the FDA. So to answer your question, it's always difficult. A drug is proven through the FDA by virtue of demonstrating safety, efficacy, and consistency. Safety was clear. The consistency was clear. It was the efficacy part that interfered with Sativex, at least with respect to cancer pain. But it has been done. It can be done again. And so everyone should understand this is a very long, drawn-out, expensive proposition. To get a drug through the FDA in the U.S. Often requires 10 to 12 years and somewhere between $700 million and $1.2 billion of expenditure. That's average.
Wow.
So there really aren't any shortcuts. On any company that was trying to go down the same path would have to basically prove safety, efficacy, and consistency on their own. You don't get to borrow from what someone has done before necessarily at all.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, that's a long and expensive process. But what an amazing experience to go through that and also hopefully pave the way for more in the future.
Sure.
And would you mind telling us a bit about what you just recently set up a company called Credo? Would you mind telling us a bit about that?
Sure. Credo Science is a limited liability company. We're going lean and mean at this point. I'm working with Nisha Whiteley, my business partner, has a long experience both in plants. She was worked for the Texas Department of Agriculture for many years, has a master's in botanical sciences, also long business experience, and she's the author of a great book for patients and their families called My Chronic Relief. We've worked together for some time. But basically, we are trying to create products and services related to cannabis and the endocannabinoid system that focuses on things aside from what THC does. There are plenty of people working on that, but we're trying to do innovative products and services that include a number of different areas, including novel extraction techniques that we think will better preserve, particularly the terpenoid components of cannabis. We have what will be an over-the-counter treatment for a very common condition where current treatments are either toxic or don't work very well. We have 2 diagnostic tests, one for an uncommon disorder that's becoming increasingly common, and one for a very common disorder that has no diagnostic test. And we're hoping that both of these will serve to legitimize these diagnoses and point the way towards better treatment. In both instances, people spend a tremendous amount of money on tests that come out negative, and then you end up with a diagnosis. But it doesn't mean that effective treatments are there. So we have theories behind what is affecting these disorders and how they can be better tackled. We also have a line of nutritional products that would be derived from cannabis that we expect to have a lot of value added compared to products already out there. And then finally, we've got cannabis-based disinfectant that we think would be very useful in today's market because it would kill not only bacteria, but fungi and envelope viruses like coronavirus. So this would be for home use. Hospital disinfectants are a different kettle of fish. They require FDA approval in the US, whereas home disinfectants are handled through the Environmental Protection Agency and Administration, And, so the bar is a little bit lower. We're quite sure that our formula will be quite effective and be a very advantageous product in terms of its safety and usability as compared to some of the chlorine bleach products, which many of us can't use because of the fumes producing headaches and other side effects.
Wow, that sounds like a very ambitious project, but yeah, very exciting as well. Lots of different avenues there.
Right. Well, I think it's just illustrative of the tremendous potential and versatility that cannabis has. It's not just about getting high. In terms of health promoting products and industrial applications, we really have only scratched the proverbial surface of what it can do.
For sure. Which gives me plenty of things to talk about on this show, which is great. Cool. Thank you, Ethan, for that summary of what you're up to and what you've been doing before. We're talk about terpenes today. And why don't we start with the really obvious question? What is a terpene?
Terpenes are the aromatic components of plants that could be found in the flower, leaves, sometimes in the roots or bark. These are going to be very familiar to people because they're among our common flavorings and scent products. So aromatherapy is the science of essential oils. So these are products that are distilled by steam from plant components to concentrate the odors. So let me give an example. When you walk down the aisle in the supermarket where the detergents are, you're hit with a variety of aromas, but especially citrus. And there's a reason for that. Lemon oil is a wonderful cleaning agent. Plus, psychologically, it denotes cleanliness to us. So when someone inhales a citrus scent, it's going to have a mood elevating effect, also an immune stimulating effect. This has been well established even in human studies. And that scent is limonene, and be familiar to anybody who rubs their thumbnail across the rind of a citrus fruit. So whether it's orange or lemon or lime, they all have a limonene base, and then the differences are due to components in minor concentration that give them more distinctive aromas that tell us what's what, whether it's a lime, lemon, or orange. And then give another example. The Japanese have a wonderful term for getting out in nature, and that's Shinrin Yoku, which means forest bathing. So there's a reason that we go out in nature. We can stimulate our senses, sight, sounds, bird song, but also smell. And it's not just nice aromas from the pine forest, but that has an actual physicochemical effect. Pining is something that causes alerting in the human brain. Does this by interfering with the breakdown of acetylcholine, which is the memory molecule in the brain. So this actually enhances memory and cognition. Pinene, when it's present in cannabis, will counteract the short-term memory impairment that THC is so infamous for producing. In the movies, Cheech and Chong, they're talking and someone loses their train of thought and everyone laughs. Well, there is an antidote to that, and it's alpha-pinene. The problem is that in most varieties of cannabis, there's little or no alpha-pinene. So this is different to how it was in generations past. Nowadays, selective breeding has created a situation where we have increasingly potent cannabis on the THC level, but most often it's also dominant in another terpene called myrcene, which in contrast to alpha-pinene is very sedating. It has a synergistic sedation effect with THC, producing the phenomenon commonly known as couch lock, which is just what it sounds like. When people get stoned and there's too much myrcene, they'll be immobilized and really can't move. So that's helpful if you need to get to sleep or that kind of thing. It's not conducive to a patient who might be looking for pain relief from cannabis, who needs to study or work at the same time. So a very different profile of the contents of cannabis is necessary to counteract that tendency towards sedation.
Wow. There's huge amounts there, isn't there? So I guess, in summary, the primary aspect of terpenes is a kind of aroma-based qualities to it, but clearly it does a lot more than just smell in a certain way.
Sure. So we need to make a distinction between what's psychological and physiological. Okay, so you can be exposed to an aroma and find it nice and find it pleasant, but then what goes on in the brain? Well, that pleasantness is reflected in some area of the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain. So there's an actual effect there. It's not just psychological. There is a biochemical reaction going on that produces that alteration of mood. And again, it can go far beyond that. Currently, with my colleague Ryan Vondre at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, we're doing experiments with THC and terpenoids to quantify and show, we hope, statistically significant differences in using THC with these different terpenoids. This would be in humans in controlled studies with advanced memory and psychological tests before and after to show salient differences. So there are plenty of people that will tell you that some of what I've just said is theoretical. We believe it's real, but we need to provide the scientific proof of this. So that's the reason behind those research studies.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. Maybe I'll just fire off a couple more basic questions.
Sure.
While we're still at the beginning. So I think you mentioned that terpenes are a feature of many plants. It's not just specific to cannabis. How many terpenes are there in existence, if you like, or that we know about? And what are the most abundant ones that feature in cannabis?
Yeah. Okay. So there's somewhere north of 20,000 identified terpenoids. Wow. I should point out that none of them so far are unique to cannabis. There have been over 200 reported in cannabis, but far and away the most commonly encountered is going to be myrcene that we previously discussed. If we're talking about abundance in nature, alpha-pinene is the most common. Limonene is second. But again, we don't find those in cannabis as often as we would like. In terms of other ones, very prominent in cannabis would be caryophyllene, which is a fascinating compound. It's not only a terpenoid, but it's a cannabinoid in its own right. It will act directly on what's called the CB2 receptor. The CB1 receptor is the psychoactive receptor in the brain that produces the high. It's also associated with pain reduction, reduction of a tendency to vomit, etc. Most of the effects that one associates with THC. But the CB2 receptor is mainly out in the body, also involved in pain and inflammation and immune responses. So caryophyllene works directly on it and can produce pain reduction and other benefits without producing a high. So obviously this can be an advantageous compound. It's also antifibrotic. It will reduce tendency towards scarring. So that would be another example. Beyond that, there are a lot of things you find a little of in cannabis as far as the terpenes go. Another good example would be linalool, a very versatile agent. It has a very strong local anesthetic effect. It's an anticonvulsant. Its addition to cannabis can make the difference between gaining control of seizures or not. But it's most well-known as an effective anti-anxiety agent. Linalool would be the primary component of lavender essential oil, and Lavender essential oil, for example, has been used in wards of demented patients, patients with Alzheimer's disease, to produce a calming, reduce agitation. And clearly it has that effect in cannabis as well. So, for example, we know that cannabis can be quite effective clinically in treating post-traumatic stress. The addition of linalool can make this more effective, and in other words, produce a synergy as far as reducing anxiety. So I think even from what we've talked about preliminarily here, you can see the possibilities of these different components in enhancing the therapeutic value of cannabis. THC does some things that are advantageous. It has side effects. So the terpenoids can contribute to the beneficial effects and reduce the adverse events associated with THC, and both of those would be considered forms of synergy.
Yeah. There's loads there, isn't there? Just before we kind of get on to the specifics of cannabis and the endocannabinoid system, is limonene the same in any plant that you find limonene? So another example, lemon, for example, and a cannabis plant that has limonene in it, are they identical on a molecular level?
Yes and no. There can be different stereoisomers, different three-dimensional configurations, and they can have different effects. But for the most part, if we're talking about citrus, it's going to be D-limonene, and it will be the same. But as I mentioned previously, if we blindfold people and we stick under their noses a lemon, a lime, and an orange, almost everyone is going to be able to tell the difference. And that is from trace components that are distinct in each one. So, if we just expose you to pure limonene, people might identify it as a citrusy odor, but they're not going to recognize it as a lemon, lime, or orange. You need the whole picture for that. So, yeah, there are some real subtleties. And what's very confusing to most people, including scientists, is essential oils, the terpenes and terpenoids, are extremely potent. And so the amounts involved that are producing the effects we've described are tiny and usually would be downplayed as being significant by most people that were looking at them. If we're talking about 1 milligram of this or 2 milligrams of that, you wouldn't ordinarily think it's going to have any effect, but these clearly do. And again, what we're trying to show in the experiments at Johns Hopkins is, there's only a little bit of this, but it can make the difference in whether someone is anxious or not when they've inhaled THC. We're trying to prove something that many of us have known or claim to have known for decades. But we again need to provide the real nitty-gritty proof to a level that will gain scientific acceptance.
Yeah, very exciting, but a huge task, right? When you, as you said earlier, over 500 compounds in plant, and many of them at trace levels, I'm sure. Quite difficult to sort of say what's doing what, and when you take one bit away, whether it changes. So just to record all of that, all of the possible permutations must be huge.
Oh, yeah, it's tremendous. I mean, again, if in any given cannabis sample, there are often going to be 3 to 5 prominent terpenoids, and then tiny amounts of many, many more. And it's funny because some plant samples will really predominate in one thing and not have a lot of diversity, whereas others, particularly if they're grown in a biodynamic way, under sun, in a soil that actually has an active microbiome, they're going to show a lot more diversity, and they may have small amounts of 20 different terpenoids that are readily identifiable. Now, again, I should emphasize these things we like to anthropomorphize, but these substances weren't put there on God's green earth for our human enjoyment. Rather, they perform ecological roles in defense of the plant, either to promote pollination, or to deter predation by insects, or to prevent feeding by browsing animals, deer, and what have you. So these perform a role for the plant, and we're just capitalizing on nature's bounty to our own advantage.
Yeah, fascinating perspective and way of looking at it as well. So it wasn't a planned question, but so why do you think they have a physiological effect on humans then? If that's not too
There's two
wide
ways
a
of
question.
looking at it. I mean, the real answer is the plant invests a great deal of metabolic energy to make these things because it enhances their survival. Now, at the same time, this attractiveness of the plant and its properties has made cannabis one of the most widespread cultivated plants on the planet. So we've helped it spread. Does the consciousness of the cannabis plant realize that we're helping it? It's becomes sort of a metaphysical question. Depends on your orientation, I suppose. But I think that certainly I would claim that there's a symbiosis here. It's benefiting from us and we're benefiting from it, although there's a lot of abuse involved on our part in how the plant gets treated. One of those forms of abuse is we've really restricted the gene pool, as I mentioned, to high THC, high myrcene plants, when it can do far better for itself and for us if we give it a chance. And that can be done with selective breeding. We don't need to resort to genetic modification or CRISPR technology or any of those things. This is a very plastic plant. What I mean by that is that we can make it do anything if we give it a chance through selective breeding.
So is that a kind of like almost retracing the steps so that the selective breeding for many years has gone in one direction to make it a much more narrowly focused plant that effectively gets you stoned or increases those sort of effects that are desirable in people wanting to look at it recreationally? And what you and other scientists would like to do in a way is go back to a much more richer and diverse profile.
Right. And one of the factors there is trying to find what are called land races. Land races are cannabis plants that have been bred in a particular area for many generations. So, we look to the traditional cannabis growing areas like Afghanistan, Thailand, northern India, Colombia, and South America. The problem is, if we go to these places, almost uniformly, the land races have been supplanted, to use an appropriate term, by genetics either from Holland or from California that are just the things I mentioned. So, it's a matter of the market has forced a movement towards high potency THC, high myrcene products to the exclusion of everything else. But these land races are adapted to local areas, to its soil, to the local insect predators. So they're better adapted. They have some very important genetic traits that we should reintroduce into cannabis breeding now. Additionally, people my vintage will tell you that cannabis was very different in the olden days. On average, it wasn't as potent, but don't let anyone fool you. There were plenty of distinctive, potent varieties available even in the 1970s. And the effects were much more diverse than we find in the market today. So there certainly is an importance to trying to find genuine land races and reintroduce those traits into modern breeding programs.
Yeah, another fascinating area. But getting back to terpenes, which is the topic of the show, you mentioned, I'm going to try and remember, caryophyllene, I think you said, right, is a terpene and a cannabinoid?
That's true.
I got it right. Excellent. So, firstly, how do terpenes interact and how is a compound able to be both?
Okay, well, we go to the source. Cannabinoids and terpenoids are both produced in what are called glandular trichomes. So capitate glandular trichomes looks like a golf ball on a tee. So these are most abundant in the unfertilized female flowering tops. And the material is concentrated there away from the plant, and it's for a reason. The cannabinoid acids are actually toxic to the plant tissue. One of the things that will happen is if a plant is not fertilized, Eventually, the trichomes will rain down on the fan leaves and cause them to be pruned. This is the plant's vain attempt to gain fertilization, which we are usually preventing because it's well known that the potency of the cannabis plant will be enhanced if you don't allow it to go to seed, but rather put all its efforts into producing these flowers. So they come from a common source, the glandular trichome. But in fact, one molecule, geranyl pyrophosphate, is a parent compound to both the cannabinoids and the terpenoids. So if you want to look at it one way, the cannabinoids and terpenoids are half siblings, but unlike some families, mixed families, they get along quite well together. So they're chemically related and come from the same source. But so far, caryophyllene is the only terpenoid that's been identified as having direct effects on cannabinoid receptor. The other ones certainly modify the effects of the cannabinoids, but it's not necessarily a direct effect on the receptor.
Okay, so right, that's a good distinction. So it actually kind of interacts with the receptors by virtue of being both. To go to the other example, when you say it modifies cannabinoids, how does it do that? Or if you're able to explain it at a high level?
Sure. Well, again, let's take two situations. Suppose there is a therapeutic effect like pain reduction. We know that THC reduces pain. CBD can reduce pain, less so, more of an anti-inflammatory. But there are a whole host of terpenoids that also have pain reduction effects, but they're through distinct mechanisms. We mentioned myrcene in a negative light in terms of its sedation, but it also has pain-relieving properties. They just happen to be more narcotic. In fact, the pain-relieving properties of myrcene can be blocked by the drug naloxone. Naloxone is what they give to addicts who have overdosed and stopped breathing because it reverses the effects of the mu opioid receptor, which is responsible not just for the pain relief from morphine and opioid drugs, but also is a respiratory depressant. So again, we can have effects from different molecules in cannabis that enhance a therapeutic endpoint, like pain. We can have different terpenes that enhance the ability to sleep, that treat insomnia. So THC enhances sleep, but similarly, myrcene will, linalool will, or any combination thereof. So there are two ways to look at the entourage, the collection of chemicals, and to produce synergy or boosting of effect. One is enhancement of a therapeutic effect, and the other is reduction of side effects. So let me use an example. Traditional Chinese medicine is famous for producing cocktails of ingredients. And so to Western medicine, it's strange because you might have 20 components, and what are they really doing? And if you test them individually, they might not do very much. But if we look at it carefully, and this has been documented, there might be a few ingredients that are going directly to the crux of the matter, treating the basic problem, target symptom or disease. And there might be other components that are reducing the toxicity of those first components. Well, cannabis is like traditional Chinese medicine in one plant because there isn't a single active ingredient. There are a host of different ingredients that work as an entourage to enhance therapeutic properties.
Wow. Good. I was about to ask you about the entourage effect, so perfect timing there. Okay, so it's sort of like all of the many bits that are involved are all playing a role in either balancing out or enhancing or mitigating undesirable effects to create something whole.
Exactly. So yeah, the entourage effect was first described in 1998 by Professor Meshulam and Ben Shabbat in Israel. Now, this originally was in relation to endocannabinoids, endogenous cannabinoids within. And this was with reference to the fact that there were two main endogenous cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-arachidonoglycerol. And on their own, they would have certain effects that are reminiscent of what THC does. But they noticed a marked enhancement of benefits, say on pain, when they were there in combination with related molecules that seemingly were inactive or minimally active on their own. So they called this the entourage effect. The next year, they pointed out that this could be akin to the situation in cannabis, but at that time, which was 1999, they suggested that this was theoretical and not yet proven. Well, we've had 21 years to show the synergies that are present, and there are abundant examples. One would be about 2005, GW did a study in cancer pain. They had three arms. There was a placebo arm, there was a high THC extract, and a high THC extract with a high CBD extract, what is currently called Sativex. And this was to treat cancer pain. After 2 weeks, the placebo and high THC extract were about equivalent in pain relief. But the high THC and high CBD extract together, Sativex, was statistically significantly better at pain relief. And the only difference was CBD with THC, an example of synergy. And again, the terpenoid components contribute to this, producing an entourage. And the entourage should be thought of as, say, soloists, which might be THC and CBD, along with the harmony and additional instruments from the entourage, which would certainly involve minor cannabinoids and the terpenoid components. So to make beautiful music, you often need an ensemble or the entourage rather than just a solo instrument or voice. That can be very nice, but often we want more involvement.
Yeah, and one would argue there's more depth to it as well, isn't there? When there's everything there. I mean, while I've got the opportunity, how big a challenge is this to the mindset of Western medicine in that it's very single molecule focused?
Yeah,
the whole idea is quite mind blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really antithetical to the current pharmaceutical model, which is based on the idea. Well, a lot of this is profit driven. Let's be clear. Suppose that in the Amazon, we discover a plant that has marked cancer fighting ability. Well, what's going to happen typically is one of two things. First, someone tries to isolate that compound and see if they can synthesize it. But what most often happens is you find it doesn't work as well as the plant itself. The second thing, and this is the typical pharmaceutical model, they'll say, okay, ingredient A is there. We're going to dicker with the molecule in a way to make it more potent and longer lasting. And they typically do this by sticking on hairy molecules or halogenating it. Typical is fluorination, which often boosts the potency of the molecule, but introduces possible toxicity. So the more traditional model of pharmaceutical development is to say, we have a target receptor. We're going to computer design a molecule that will lodge on that receptor with the highest potency and the highest affinity. And that's how you start. The problem is that very often, way down the road, sometimes years later, they find out that there's some previously unknown toxicity associated with it, that it poisons the liver or poisons the bone marrow. And so we have a situation where all too frequently, drugs that have been approved in the EU or by the FDA in the US make it to the market. And then when thousands of people are using it all of a sudden, we discover some previously unknown toxicity and they're yanked from the market. In contrast, botanical medicine is based on traditional knowledge where people may have been using this for many thousands of years. So we're well aware of what their inherent toxicity may be. And this is usually quite limited. I'm not going to say all plants from nature are safe. That's ridiculous. There are plenty of poisons in nature. But, that also raises the point. The words for medicine and poison are synonymous in many languages around the world, including Greek. So it's a matter of dose.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, there are two groups of physicians, those that strictly adhere to the modern pharmaceutical approach, and those that realize that there's a place for natural medicine, often in conjunction with conventional pharmacotherapy. I'm one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you described that. I had another recent guest, Dr. Rachel Knox, on the show, and she described it in a similar way that, the synthesized molecule may fit perfectly on the receptor. It's designed as close to doing that, but it doesn't break down in the same way. So it might stick around for longer than it's needed, etc. And these are the things that over time cause unwanted effects.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas all of the other magic that happens in the plant helps to keep it there for as long as it's needed and then gets rid of it very efficiently.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Raises an important point. Anandamide, the endogenous cannabinoid, and THC are both what are called weak partial agonists at the CB1 receptor. So what that means is that they bind to that receptor, but only weakly. So they're working in a subtle way. This is in contrast to the synthetic cannabinoids that some people are using to evade drug testing. So K2, spice, and hundreds of other molecules. Often these are full agonists that might be 100 times or more potent than THC. So these are downright dangerous, and it's not just that mechanism. Often these have off-target effects that produce toxicity of their own. So those drugs really have nothing to do with cannabis, and no one should make the mistake of confabulating toxicity from synthetics like that with what cannabis does. They're not comparable situations.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up and clarifying that. Cool. So just to round things off on the terpenes piece, and it fits in nicely to what you just said. Presumably, people can synthesize terpenes as well as trying to synthesize everything else, and they do.
Right. For instance, many of the chemical markets produce their terpenes from petroleum. As usual, nature does it better. And if we compare the scent of some of those products to naturally derived essential oils, there's no comparison. The average person is going to definitely prefer the scent of the natural elements.
Yeah, sure. Cool. Okay, cool. So we're moving towards the end. I just thought I might ask you a bit of a macro question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Having been around this, particularly from a medical standpoint, many doctors are wary of cannabis for some of the reasons that you outlined. They're quite wedded to the Western single molecule pharmaceutical model. But equally, I think a concern is a bit around the non-specific nature of cannabis, and well, at least to their minds it is. How do you think we overcome that, with the medical establishment?
Well, we do it with science. It's incumbent upon us to produce quality products that have quality control and consistency. So to a certain extent, I would hope that the industry would police itself. Otherwise, standards will eventually be imposed from outside, and they may not be enlightened ones. But like it or not, the sine qua non of medical proof is the randomized controlled trial. It's a very flawed model, but it's the one we're stuck with in terms of getting drugs approved. And I would just say that I think there are a lot of people fooling themselves. Yes, there will be pharmaceutical forms of cannabis. There already are, as we've mentioned, but it's a mistake to think that that's going to eliminate supplements that might be made from cannabis or more artisanal forms that such as herbal cannabis from a reputable grower. There are always going to be these three echelons of activity with respect to cannabis, and it's folly to think that one can eliminate the others. Whether it's legal remains if someone tries to impose that you can only use this preparation, there's going to remain a black market to everyone's detriment. Black markets are antithetical to safety and consistency. And so I think we need to up the game in terms of producing quality products that are science-based, and that can apply to any of the three echelons.
Absolutely. And just a final round off that, how important do you think personalized medicine is in relation to cannabis, and what might work on your body is going to be different to mine?
Sure. Well, I think it highlights the importance of this. For a given condition, I personally feel that I have a good idea of what that person might benefit from taking in terms of cannabis with a certain profile. There are many people who use cannabis that may use one preparation during the day so that they can be alert and control their pain, and a different one at night so they can get to sleep. So that's not always so conducive to having a single pharmaceutical preparation that's going to cover the bases. So again, this is why we find people using different kinds of products. We're all a little different. We may have different combinations of illnesses that require individualized approaches. So ultimately, cannabis may be the ultimate approach, benefit in individualized medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay. Well, my traditional final question is, what did your family say when you decided to specialize in cannabis as a form of medicine?
Well, my kids were young at the time. They didn't have a big voice in it. I think my wife realizes I have certain idiosyncrasies that I'm not going to give up on. Well, same would apply to my colleagues in medicine. A lot of people were skeptical in the beginning, but when they started seeing the results that patients had, the benefits, not just with cannabis, but with other aspects of botanical medicine, many of them understood that we were definitely onto something.
Great. Yeah, that's good. Cool. Well, Ethan, thank you so much for joining me on this under lockdown circumstances, which is kind of you to spare your time. It's been really, really useful, and I could have talked to you for hours, actually. So I'd love to have you back on at some point, because I'm sure there's much more we could talk about.
Sure. Very good. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Take care.